3 days after a powerful CEO laughed at a single father for dragging home a rusted $200 car, a racing legend stood in that same driveway and offered $10 million for it. And nobody on that street ever spoke about junk the same way again. On a quiet suburban block just outside Phoenix, Ethan Cole lived a life that most people barely noticed, the kind of life that didn't come with headlines or applause, only routine and responsibility. He woke up before sunrise every day, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. At 5:15 each morning, the alarm buzzed once before he reached over and shut it off, careful not to wake his daughter, Lily, who slept in the next room with the soft hum of a fan and a nightlight shaped like a moon. He would move through the house quietly, starting coffee, packing a lunch that was simple but consistent, checking the small whiteboard on the fridge where he kept track of bills, shifts, and reminders written in neat, blocky handwriting. There was no margin for error in his life, no extra space for impulse decisions, and certainly no room for mistakes that cost money. Since his wife, Rachel, passed away 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, everything had narrowed into something precise and controlled, like a machine that couldn't afford to break down. Ethan worked mornings at a distribution warehouse loading freight, a job that paid just enough to keep the lights on, and in the evenings he took on repair work in the garage behind his house, fixing cars for neighbors and referrals who appreciated his honesty even if they didn't always pay on time. It was not the life he had imagined, but it was the one he maintained, carefully, day by day, for Lily. She was 8, bright, observant, and far more perceptive than most adults gave her credit for, the kind of child who noticed when her father paused too long at the grocery store shelf comparing prices, or when he pretended not to see a bill sitting unopened on the counter. She never complained, never asked for things she knew they couldn't afford, and when she did want something, she framed it as a question rather than a request, as if giving him room to say no without feeling like he had let her down. On that particular Friday afternoon, Ethan wasn't looking for anything unusual when he drove out to the salvage yard on the edge of town, a place he had visited dozens of times over the years, always for practical reasons, always with a specific part in mind. The yard was the same as ever, rows of dismantled vehicles under the sun, the faint metallic smell of oil and rust hanging in the air, the sound of distant tools echoing across the lot. He walked past sedans missing doors, trucks stripped down to frames, engines stacked like forgotten machinery, until he found what he needed, a used alternator that would help him finish a repair job waiting back home. He was already on his way out when something in the far corner of the yard caught his attention, not because it stood out, but because it didn't quite fit. It was a car, technically, though at first glance it barely qualified as one, its surface eaten away by rust, paint long gone, tires half sunken into the dirt. Most people would have dismissed it instantly, and judging by its placement at the edge of the lot, most people already had. But Ethan slowed down, then stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the shape of it. The proportions were off in a way that was subtle but undeniable, the body sitting lower than expected, the lines not matching any standard model he could recall. He stepped closer without fully deciding to, crouching slightly to look along the side panel, running his hand lightly over the metal as if confirming something he couldn't yet explain. It didn't feel like a mass-produced car. It felt deliberate. "That one's 200, the yard owner called out from behind him, not even bothering to walk over. "Honestly, I'd just scrap it Monday if nobody takes it." Ethan straightened up slowly, glancing back at the man, then at the car again. $200 wasn't nothing. It was groceries, or part of a utility bill, or a buffer for something unexpected, and unexpected things happen more often than he liked. He should have walked away. By every logical measure, that would have been the correct decision. But logic wasn't what kept him standing there. There was something else, something quieter, harder to define. The same instinct he relied on when diagnosing a problem under a hood, the sense that there was more here than what was visible on the surface. He exhaled slowly, reached into his wallet, and said, "I'll take it." The tow back to his neighborhood was uneventful but noticeable, the rusted car trailing behind his pickup like a question nobody had asked yet. By the time he pulled into his driveway, a few neighbors had already taken notice, subtle at first, a glance from a window, a pause during a walk, the quiet awareness that something out of the ordinary was happening on an otherwise predictable street. Among them was Vanessa Hale, who lived directly across from Ethan and represented, in many ways, the opposite end of a spectrum. She was successful, visible, and unapologetically confident, the CEO of a tech company that had grown rapidly over the past few years, bringing her both wealth and a reputation for sharp decision-making. Her house was immaculate, her schedule precise, her standards high, and she had little patience for what she considered poor judgment. She stepped out just as Ethan finished parking, her expression already forming into something between amusement and disbelief. "You actually paid for that?" she called out, her voice carrying easily across the street. A couple of neighbors lingered nearby, their curiosity now fully engaged. Ethan didn't answer immediately, focusing instead on unhooking the tow strap, his movements steady and unhurried. Vanessa took a few steps closer, folding her arms. I get fixing cars," she continued, "but that thing looks like it should have been crushed years ago." There was a light laugh from somewhere behind her, quickly stifled but not unnoticed. Ethan glanced briefly toward Lily, who had come out onto the porch with her backpack still on, watching the scene unfold with quiet attention. "Go inside, kiddo," he said gently. "I'll be in soon." She hesitated for a second, then nodded and went in without a word. Vanessa shook her head slightly, almost smiling. "You know," she added, "kids learn by watching. You might want to think about what this teaches her." Ethan looked at her then, not with anger, not even with annoyance, but with a calm that came from having faced harder things than criticism from across the street. "Have a good evening," he said simply, then turned back to the car. The conversation ended there, at least outwardly, but the impression lingered, carried quietly through the neighborhood as people returned to their routines, each of them forming their own conclusions about the man, the car, and the decision that had just been made. That night, long after the street had gone quiet and the lights in neighboring houses had dimmed, Ethan stood alone in his garage with a single overhead bulb casting a soft, uneven glow over the rusted frame. He placed his hand on the car again, the same way he had in the salvage yard, and this time he didn't rush. He just stood there for a moment, listening in the only way he knew how, not for a sound, but for a feeling, the faint, persistent sense that something about this car mattered, even if he couldn't yet say why. By the second night, Ethan stopped thinking of the car as a bad decision and started treating it like a problem he needed to solve. He worked after Lily went to bed, same as always, but slower, more focused, as if the car required patience instead of effort. The first layer to come off was dirt, years of it, packed into every seam. Beneath that, rust, uneven, heavy in places, strangely light in others, revealing metal that had been preserved more carefully than it should have been. As he moved from the rear forward, something began to feel off in a way he couldn't ignore. The body lines didn't match any production car he knew. The curves were too intentional, the proportions too precise. When he ran his hand along the side panel, he could feel it. This wasn't stamped metal. It had been shaped, built. Around midnight, he slid a work light under the chassis and lay flat on the garage floor. That's when things shifted. The frame wasn't standard. Extra reinforcement had been welded into key stress points, not roughly, but with precision. Every joint looked planned. Every addition had a purpose. He traced one weld with his fingers, feeling the smoothness of it, the confidence in the work. This wasn't someone experimenting. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ethan stayed under there longer than he needed to, studying angles, connections, structure, until a quiet realization settled in. This car wasn't meant for the road. The next morning, he called Marcus Reed, an older mechanic who had taught him more than anyone else early in his career. Marcus arrived expecting something routine. Instead, he walked into the garage, took one look at the car, and went silent. He circled it slowly, crouching near the suspension, then moving to the front, his expression tightening. "This isn't normal," he said finally. "You didn't just buy a project. You bought something built for stress, real stress." He pointed at the frame. "This kind of reinforcement? That's not for everyday driving. That's for racing. We're testing something that can't afford to fail." He leaned into the engine bay, studying the block. "And this has been modified for balance, not just speed." He stepped back, looking at Ethan directly. Whoever made this knew exactly what they were doing, and they weren't building it for fun. After Marcus left, Ethan didn't pick up his tools. Instead, He sat at the small desk in the corner and started searching. He took photos of the chassis, the welds, the suspension, and uploaded them to a niche online forum for vintage and experimental cars. He kept the description simple, just the facts. Within hours, replies came in. At first, they were predictable: guesses, disagreements, people insisting it was just a heavily modified kit car. But then the tone began to shift. A few users pointed out details others missed: the geometry of the frame, the style of the welds, the unusual proportions. By evening, the thread had grown far beyond anything Ethan expected. He read carefully, ignoring the noise, focusing on the few voices that sounded certain. Late that night, a private message appeared. It was short: "If those markings are real, you might have something that was never meant to be found." Ethan stared at the message, then went back to the garage immediately. He started checking areas he had overlooked, moving slower now, more deliberate. That's when he found it. On the inner side of the door frame, partially hidden beneath old layers of paint. A marking, not a VIN, not a label, something engraved. Letters, numbers, and beside them, a small symbol that looked almost like a signature. He cleaned it carefully, exposing more of it, his focus sharpening. He took a photo and went back inside, searching again, this time with something specific to match. Hours passed. Most results led nowhere. But sometime after 2 a.m., he found something that made him stop completely. It was an old archived article about a prototype race car built decades earlier, experimental, never released, and reportedly lost before it ever surfaced publicly. There were no photos, only descriptions, but one detail stood out. The lead engineer had marked key components with a unique engraved signature. Ethan looked back at his phone. The symbol he had found wasn't similar. It was identical. He leaned back slowly, the weight of it settling in. This wasn't just a rare car. This was something that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The next morning, the street felt different, even if nothing had visibly changed. A few neighbors slowed as they passed, glancing toward the garage. Across the street, Vanessa noticed too. She had dismissed the car instantly, written it off as a bad decision. But now there was a tension, quiet but growing, and it didn't match her first impression. She opened her laptop, curiosity replacing certainty, and started searching. The pieces she found didn't give her answers, but they raised questions, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she had been right. Inside the garage, Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a form reply. It was an email. Short, professional, direct. Someone important had seen the photos, and they wanted to see the car in person. 3 days after the laughter, a black sedan pulled up outside Ethan's house, and the same driveway that had been the subject of quiet jokes suddenly became the center of attention. Ethan stood waiting, calm but alert, while across the street, Vanessa watched from behind her window, no longer smiling. The man who stepped out didn't waste time. He walked straight into the garage, eyes fixed on the car, and the moment he saw it, he stopped, completely still. Then he moved closer, running his hand along the metal with a kind of care that made it clear this wasn't just another vehicle to him. "I thought this was gone," he said quietly. Ethan frowned slightly. "You know it?" The man nodded. "I built it." The words landed heavily, changing everything in an instant. He explained briefly. Years ago, the car had been a prototype, something experimental, ahead of its time, and then it vanished, presumed destroyed. Until now. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "Junkyard," Ethan replied. $200. The man gave a small, almost impressed smile. Then his assistant stepped forward and turned a tablet toward Ethan. The number on the screen was simple and impossible at the same time. $10 million. "That's my offer," the man said. No negotiation. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked toward the house, where Lily stood quietly watching. He walked over to her and crouched down. "What do you think?" he asked. She looked at the car, then back at him. "It's special," she said softly. "But maybe everyone should see it." Ethan nodded, stood up, and turned back. "I'll sell it," he said. "But it goes somewhere public." The man agreed immediately. And just like that, the deal was done. No drama. No delay. A few days later, the car was gone, lifted carefully onto a transport truck while neighbors watched in silence. Vanessa walked across the street, slower than usual. "I was wrong," she said. Ethan shrugged lightly. "It happens." She hesitated, then added, "I shouldn't have said that." Ethan met her eyes briefly. "Next time," he said calmly, Wait a few days before deciding what something's worth.